Here is a blue ink by Diplomat Royal Blue.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
Here's a blue that is as basic a blue as you can get. To be fair, Royal Blue isn't a tone of blue for me, but it isn't for many others because it is the basic blue many used in school. Paler than can easily get as a blue. It's a much more pale blue than typically I go for, and many other people. Still very easy to read on the page, not any kind of real problem there. There's a lot of tone variation by pen, and so there's options to choose from depending on the pen you use. It does shade well and frequently. Still has for me this feeling that it's missing the mark for me. Mostly because, again, royal blue isn't my thing. But you're missing out if royal blue is a color that you like. I do think it performs very well.
The pen for today is an Aurora Optima. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the lightest, hardest to read tone from this ink. Now we get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get shading that comes across very nicely. I'm wondering if the music of the car going by is coming through. I'll find that out in editing. I'll leave this in so we can figure out how good I've been doing on trying to cancel some of that noise. No feather, no spread, yet shades very well. I think it's doing okay. I wouldn't want a whole page of this. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. Very dark for this ink, and I really don't care for what I'm seeing here. It loses the royal blue look of things, and yeah, it's just not for me. Now, there's no feathering and there's no spread. There is a little bit of shading, not as much shading, or it's just as much shading as the soft fine. Not as prominent as the soft fine because of the way this blue is looking. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, darker than it was with the soft fine. Real royal blue right here. The color is spot on for what it should be. No feather, no spread, shades well. Not super nice, but definitely shading very well. A lot of in and out of mid and dark tones for what we're getting here. You really do see it on onto and them and front, so it's definitely there. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was with the medium. No feather, no spread. Shades, I think the shading is not as much as the medium. I don't think it's shading as well, but the difference between the lighter and darker tones is more pronounced. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There was approximately 5 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairefontaine with no feather, with no spread, with shading that's going, I think, a little bit nicer in how it's coming across on this paper. I think the paper does better for this ink because it's a bit more absorbent, making it kind of stand out on the page better. So don't use this ink on your Clairefontaines, but on your non-fountain pen friendly papers, it appears to be doing a little bit nicer. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine with no feather, no spread. It does shade very well. You really see it in dwarf on the third line or at on the third line. So it definitely is shading very nicely if this is what you're looking for. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine nib. Same tone as the Clairefontaine with no feather, no spread. It does shade not as well as it did on the Clairefontaine, but it is shading very nicely on this paper. I think it comes across visually. I think the ink looks nicer on this paper than it did on the Clairefontaine. It just, because the paper is not coated, the paper's look is flatter, which makes the ink stand out a little bit better. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the medium. Same tone as the Clairefontaine with no feather, no spread, light shading, less shading than it had on the Clairefontaine. Certainly easy to read on the page. I can always wish that something shaded more, and actually here, while I can say it could shade more, I think it's shading the right amount for the color that I'm seeing, because if I was getting more shading, then I would have to deal with more lighter colors. Looking at the back of the page, there's no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairefontaine. Definitely easier to read on this paper than it was on the Clairefontaine. The yellow tone is really helping it out to become easier on the eyes. So the fact that it's light here isn't really hurting my ability to read it. Now, we get no feathering and we get no spread. It shades just as well as it did on the Clairefontaine in that we get some darker letters throughout. Take a look at the second line. From starts lighter, gets dark at the R, lightens up at the O to a nice mid-tone at the M. And that's the kind of shading behavior that it's happening this entire way through. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, little bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine with no feather, no spread, no shading. It's just there. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. No feather, no spread. It is shading, not as well as it did on the Clairefontaine, but you certainly see it there. Take a look at fact on the second line. Starts a little bit lighter, starts darker, gets lighter, gets darker again at the T. Same with should. S is a little lighter than the H. It lightens up in the middle, darkens up at the LD at the end. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the medium. bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. We get very, very light feathering I'm seeing here on Oakenshield and No and About. There's a little bit of light feathering going on, but I don't get any kind of spread from it. I also see only hints of shading. Again, Oakenshield, you do see some shading going on in that word. Same with About directly beneath it. But I don't think that shading is what you would really expect of this ink on this paper normally. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get very minimal ghosting and we have nothing for bleeding. Nothing came through and touched the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is just a tad bit, the tiniest bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine, with no feather, no spread, shades just as well as it did on the Clairefontaine, giving us just an occasional dark letter. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine, with no feather, no spread. It does still shade. You see it in grandfather a little bit on the second line, but hospitality on the fourth line, where I backed up and went to correct the letter, it gets much darker, which shows that it can shade, just not standing out here very much. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. No feather, no spread. It does shade. I mean, you see it in Thorin, and you see it in Not and To and Say. You see it in just about every word. I don't think the shading that's going on here looks as nice, because when it shades, it's not getting as dark as it could based on what I'm seeing with the Clairefontaine. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, just a little bit lighter still than the Clairefontaine, with no feather, no spread. There's only a very light peppering of shading. There's almost none. You barely want to say it, but you do see spots of it in the quote marks or at the bottom of the H in he or the S in is. So there is little bits of darker spots that occur that I guess you can call shading. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diatramentis Robert Koch Adular Blue. Here is Diamine Sargasso C. Here is Pelican 4001 Royal Blue. Here is Roher and Klingner Document Light Blue. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone that we had on the Clairefontaine. Exactly the same. No change for the paper, where normally here it gets a little flatter or dustier looking. Nope, exactly the same, with no feather, no spread. It does shade. I actually think the shading is showing up a little bit better here than it did on the Clairefontaine, but still, the shading that shows up in itself is light when it's present, as in it's only tiny little spots. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, tiny bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine, which is a little unusual. No feather, no spread, no shade, simply present on the page. And honestly, doesn't look like a royal blue to me. Just don't think that wet fine's doing it justice. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, little lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, with no feather, with no spread, with no shading. It's there on the page. It's very consistent in tone. It is absolutely just a school blue at this point. It's being what it's supposed to be, so you really can't complain other than it's not for me. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, which is a little lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. Looks like it's been sun faded compared to the Clairefontaine. No feather, no spread. We do get some light shading that's going on. You see elves on the first line, and directly under it, the. The is quite a bit darker, and even that goes lighter to darker as a word. Hills goes darker to lighter to darker. I think it's shading much better on the broad, so if you're a student that likes using royal blue, use a nice medium flow broad to get this effect. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Thornton's Pink. Here is an orange ink by Sailor Gentle Apricot. Here is a magenta ink by Sailor Zodiac Aries.
Here is a yellow ink by Sailor Studio 770.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. It does feather, it does spread, it does have bits of shading. What we get to see here is the most like what would happen for students in America, because we're going to get that crappy copy paper that's meant to operate like a sponge, because they use the same quality paper as the hand towels in the bathroom. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. Lots of feathering all over the place. Lots of spread, a little bit more than a broad. No shading, not perfect as a tone. Yucky in general really is how I'm going to go ahead and leave this. It's certainly not really for me. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, tiny bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. Yes, we get feathering. Yes, we get spread. We actually get a couple moments of shading, which, are just kind of there, but boy, oh boy, it doesn't look good in general, and when it shades and it gives those little bit darker spots, that's not helping it. It's just that not good here in the medium. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, a little lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, with plenty of feathering. Did you want some feathers? Here's a few. Here's some spread. Oh yeah, it spreads a lot. Just, I do struggle on the 20-pound copy paper samples because I'm not used to dealing with this spread so much. No shading, No real character. It's really there, and that's it. I don't know that the broad is a great option here. Looking at the page underneath, there was a couple spots in the broad, a spot in the medium, a couple spots in the wet fine, couple spots in the soft fine, so it bleeds through touching the page underneath. None of those spots were super dark where you couldn't use them, but I just wouldn't want to. When we see the back of the page, we can completely understand why. Because of the extreme amount of ghosting that's going on, you could not take notes back here and be able to read both sides.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
In general, a dry pen is just too light, and a wet pen is dark, making it look off from Royal Blue. But a medium flow, medium nib is just right. It really gives you a very nice Royal Blue tone. The best version of Royal Blue, at least, and a fair amount of shading.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.